The dawn was tentative that morning, a pale hesitation of light drifting over the high street, seeping through the mist that clung stubbornly to the ancient stone of King's Spire. I walked slowly, letting the uneven cobbles press through my soles, listening to the faint scrape of a cartwheel somewhere in the distance, the occasional clatter of shutters being lifted. There was a peculiar quality to Oxford before the city had properly awoken, a hush that made one notice the smell of wet paper, the faint tang of coal smoke from a nearby hearth, the delicate sharpness of autumn in the air. Even the pigeons seemed reluctant to make themselves heard, shivering on ledges and parapets as though aware of some unspoken expectation. I passed the newspaper stall at the corner, idly scanning the headlines, and there it was King's manuscript discovered after decades. The letters seemed almost to hum in the cold morning, a curiosity dangling between history and rumor. I bought the paper, not for the news itself, but for the fragrance of print and ink, the tiny sense of ritual that comes with holding freshly turned pages. A faint line of frost clung to my overcoat collar as I turned it over, and for a moment I was elsewhere entirely, imagining the dimmed library rooms and the scent of parchment that had remained unchanged for centuries. The streets were nearly deserted, except for a solitary figure crossing Magdalen Bridge, their coat flapping too loosely in the morning wind. I thought of Lewis and his eagerness for action, of the cases that always seemed to wait for him while I lingered in half-conscious observation. I could hear the faint creak of the bridge timbers beneath my own boots and felt, as I often did, that one could learn a great deal from silence, from the absence of everything except the minutiae of motion. The bell of Tom Tower tolled once, muffled as if apologizing for disturbing the day's fragile stillness. I stopped outside the library, drawn as much by habit as by curiosity. A hand-lettered notice hung on the door. Viewing hours begin today. The paper was slightly crooked, a trivial detail perhaps, yet in its casual misalignment there seemed a small rebellion against precision, a human signature that spoke of something overlooked. I noted it, storing it away with others, the misplaced ledger page, the faintly anxious glance of a porter, the smell of old leather and dust. I lingered a moment longer, glancing up the street toward the coffee house where I would normally meet Lewis for a weak cup of something bitter and hot. The fog was thicker now, curling around lampposts and the tops of walls, obscuring shapes until they were no more than shadows of intention. It was a morning that seemed to demand patience, to reward those willing to notice the subtlety of being rather than the drama of doing. As I stepped onto the bridge again, my mind returned to the manuscript, a faintly coded message, perhaps, in its discovery. A puzzle, almost certainly. And somewhere beneath that thought, the quiet acknowledgement that Oxford had always had a way of hiding its secrets in plain sight, in the spaces between spires, in the unhurried turn of a page, in the pause before a bell strikes. I felt, in that small solitude, the first stirrings of curiosity that would not leave me for the days to come. I remember the manuscript room as a place of both illumination and restraint, the air heavy with the weight of centuries, and the faint tang of ink that had long since dried yet lingered stubbornly in every corner. The morning light filtered through tall, narrow windows, dust motes suspended like tiny lanterns in the cold stillness. I had passed the threshold quietly, noticing the slight unevenness of the polished floorboards, the faint tremor in the librarian's hands as she adjusted a brass clasp on a display case. Small details, easily dismissed, but in Oxford, nothing is ever entirely without significance. The manuscript lay encased beneath glass, its vellum pages pale as bone, the script a delicate sprawl of letters that seemed to breathe with a past long forgotten. I allowed my eyes to linger over the meticulous script, the margins crowded with annotations, the careful but not quite perfect ink strokes. Something about the symmetry or the deliberate imperfection suggests the hand of someone accustomed to attention yet unwilling to be constrained entirely by form. A slight smudge, a tiny corner turned just so, these were the moments that begin to whisper of human involvement, of pride or error hidden beneath apparent perfection. There were others present, curators and fellows whose faces bore the kind of polite interest that conceals both curiosity and unease. One mentioned casually the manuscript's miraculous survival, a phrase that carried too much reverence to be casual. Another, a younger scholar, adjusted his glasses and muttered something about a lost page that had never resurfaced, and I made note of the faint flush on his neck as he quickly diverted his gaze. These gestures are not accidental, I reflected, and they often speak louder than the clearest statements. The room smelled of old leather bindings, a faint hint of damp creeping in from the stones beneath the windows. I walked slowly along the perimeter, observing the precise alignment of folios, the occasional dust speck that betrayed a hurried cleaning, the very slight unevenness of a wooden lectern. Small discrepancies, yet in a collection so disciplined, they become telling. I found myself drawn to a marginal note, a line that had been altered, the ink slightly darker than its surroundings, suggesting a revision made in haste or secrecy. I made a mental notation. A crossword lay discarded on a table, open at the last clue of the previous day's paper. One word, curiously intersecting with another, struck me for its odd relevance as the clue for a forgotten king, an almost imperceptible echo of the manuscript's origin. I wondered, not for the first time, how often truth hides in such subtleties, how often the human mind is nudged by the smallest of prompts toward understanding what is otherwise obscured. I noted, too, the interactions, the hesitation in speech, the careful avoidance of certain glances. It is not always what is said that carries weight, but what remains suspended, unspoken, and the movement of the hands, the tilt of the head, the pause before acknowledgement. Oxford teaches patience and observation here. In the manuscript room, those skills become indispensable. As I left, the glass reflecting my shadow along with the pale ancient text, I felt the quiet stirrings of something unresolved. A manuscript preserved for centuries, yet already entangled in the subtle human dramas that cling to every artifact. The discovery would provoke pride, envy, perhaps even something darker, and I knew that each small gesture observed today would ripple outward in ways not yet discernible. It was just after mid-morning when the note arrived, slipped under the archivist's door with the sort of deliberate quiet that makes one wonder at both the hand that wrote it and the mind that sent it. I had been lingering in the hallway outside the manuscript room, listening to the faint creak of floorboards as if the building itself were sighing under the weight of centuries. The paper was thin, the edges unevenly cut, and the ink a rich dark brown that suggested both age and care. There was a formality to its script, a rhythmic curl to certain letters, and yet an irregularity that hinted at haste or perhaps emotional agitation. The message itself was brief, a few lines veiled in elusive language, warning of consequences should the manuscript be disturbed. I held it up to the light, turning it over slowly, noting the minute pressure of the pen on the fibers, the way a certain stroke pressed harder at one point, as though the writer had paused mid-thought, reconsidered, or perhaps hesitated at a moment of conscience. My mind ticked quietly, cataloguing details, the slant of the letters, the peculiar crossing of the T's, the unusually consistent spacing that almost but not quite betrayed the writer's control. I returned it to the archivist, who examined it with a frown and a hand trembling more than was appropriate for one accustomed to centuries of fragile parchment. Her eyes lingered on a phrase, then darted to the door as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. There was a momentary tightness in her throat, an imperceptible hitch that spoke of both fear and protective instinct. One notices such things if one walks through Oxford long enough, and I did. It is not always the words, but the body that tells a story. A young fellow hovered nearby, ostensibly arranging folios, but actually observing. and I caught a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, the brief narrowing of his eyes. A silent calculation, or the kind of instinctive reaction that betrays more than 1,000 spoken sentences. I filed it away with the other small curiosities. The crooked sign on the door, the dust on the ledge that had not been disturbed, the forgotten bookmark left between centuries-old pages. They would form a constellation later if one was patient enough to wait. As I pondered the note, I was struck by a curious echo in a crossword I had left open on the archivist's desk. The clue for a word meaning hidden intention intersected with one suggesting caution, and the answers, neatly written, seemed almost to mirror the sentiment of the message. It was, of course, nothing more than coincidence, or was it a subtle reminder that intelligence and cunning often walk hand in hand with the mundane, that even in small amusements, hints of human preoccupation might be found? I left the manuscript room then, the note folded carefully in my pocket, feeling the weight of its mystery, as one might carry a delicate object, aware that a sudden jolt could undo all that had been preserved. Outside, the air had grown colder, mist curling at the base of the walls, and I thought briefly of Lewis, whose instinct for the practical often contrasted with my own inclination toward observation and reflection. The day was settling into a rhythm that promised quiet revelations and muted anxieties, and I knew that this small, handwritten warning would prove both guide and distraction in the days to come. The curator's lecture was scheduled for mid-afternoon, a time when the sunlight through the library's high windows casts long, trembling shadows across the stone floor, making every movement feel slightly theatrical. I arrived early, noting the faint scent of old vellum mingling with polished wood and the sharper tang of ink that had seeped from centuries of manuscripts. A small gathering had assembled, mostly fellows with sharp eyes and guarded expressions, their polished shoes tapping softly against the worn boards as they settled into the chairs that seemed too stiff, too deliberate for comfort. The curator began with practiced ease, recounting the manuscript's provenance and the curious tale of its survival. I observed, as always, more than I heard. A slight hesitation in his voice as he mentioned a particular missing page, a subtle quickening of the pulse in one of the younger fellows, and a glance that flicked too briefly toward the window. All small anomalies, yet in aggregate they formed a constellation that invited scrutiny. One notices such things in Oxford, where civility is often a mask for intrigue. He spoke of the meticulous care taken over centuries, of scribes and scholars whose names are etched in the margins of history, and yet I was drawn to a minor detail, the way he referred to a letter as having been lost or mislaid, the gentle tilt of his hand as he gestured toward a case. It seemed almost rehearsed, a deliberate obfuscation. I noted the precise spacing of his words, the cadence of his sentences, and the faint redness on the archivist's cheek as she adjusted her spectacles. People reveal themselves in pauses, in the subtlest gestures, and I catalogued each in quiet, invisible margins. There was a minor flourish, almost incidental, when he lifted the manuscript to display a particularly intricate illumination. A whisper of movement in the corner of the room, a foot sliding backward, a hand brushing against a folio caught my attention. Too slight for anyone else to register, yet it spoke volumes about nervousness, about an awareness that someone was watching. I filed it away alongside the crooked sign outside, the marginal ink, the smudge left on a vellum page. Together, they began to form a lattice of meaning. The lecture proceeded into the manuscript's textual peculiarities, and I found my mind tracing connections, recalling lines from the crossword I had glanced at that morning, the faintly mirrored pattern in the letters, echoing phrases in the manuscript itself. There is often a symmetry in these things, a subtle resonance between the trivial and the consequential, and it is one's task to notice it. A minor detail, misaligned comma, a slightly askew binding can illuminate a path through the most tangled narrative. At the conclusion, as the assembled fellows murmured polite assent and shuffled papers, I lingered near the lectern. I noticed the archivist's fingers pressed too firmly against the edge of a desk, the faint crease in the young scholar's jacket that suggested restless pacing, and the curator himself, for all his composed manner, allowed a shadow of apprehension to pass across his face. Each observation was a thread, delicate and easily overlooked, but together they hinted at a tension beneath the surface, an imperceptible discord in a room ostensibly dedicated to order. As I stepped back into the corridor, the echoes of their voices fading, I felt the quiet certainty that the manuscript had become more than an artifact. It was a locus of human ambition, pride, and caution. And somewhere in that subtle choreography of attention and avoidance, the first true outlines of the mystery began to take form, elusive yet persistent, like the lingering shadow of the evening sun across the polished stones. The garden was almost entirely deserted that afternoon, the hedges and yew trees casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch and contract as the sun tilted toward evening. I walked slowly along the gravel paths, noting the dampness in the soil from a light morning drizzle, the scent of fallen leaves mixed with the faint aroma of clipped boxwood. Oxford has a way of making even ordinary gardens feel like cathedrals of quiet thought, places where human intention and natural order intersect in patterns both deliberate and accidental. I noticed immediately the subtle signs of recent disturbance, footprints that did not align with any of the gardener's usual paths. A faintly displaced branch lying across a stone bench, a scattering of petals that seemed unusually haphazard. Such details, trivial to an unobservant eye, spoke of movement, of presence, of human purpose that attempted clumsily to remain unseen. I catalogued them quietly, each one an incalculable clue. A figure emerged among the yews, careful and deliberate, glancing over the shoulder as if to measure the distance to the nearest doorway. It was Dr. Alden, the newcomer to King's College, moving with the kind of precise awareness that suggested familiarity with avoidance. He greeted me with a nod that was almost imperceptible, and I returned it, noting the slight stiffness in his posture, the tremor in his right hand as it rested on the hilt of a walking stick. A gesture perhaps insignificant, yet in context, it spoke volumes. As we moved along the path, I observed a small, almost imperceptible crumpling of a leaf beneath his foot, a detail that seemed to flicker with meaning only because it was so carefully restrained elsewhere. He mentioned casually an interest in botany, a fleeting comment about the roses, and yet the mention of a certain historic yew drew an involuntary hesitation, a pause just long enough to betray recognition, perhaps of a memory best left undisturbed. People reveal themselves not only in words, but in the spaces between them, and I had learned to watch for such silences. A pigeon took flight, startling us both, and my gaze fell on the edge of a sundial where a small slip of paper had been tucked, barely visible in the lengthening shadows. I retrieved it carefully, noting a few scrawled words and a date, the ink slightly smudged. It was minor, trivial perhaps, yet it seemed connected, a small signal amid a larger, unseen pattern. I could not yet decipher its full significance, but I felt the stirrings of insight that would eventually guide understanding. I walked back toward the main quadrangle, retracing steps, observing the play of light on the walls, the slight sway of a branch as a gentle wind passed. The garden had revealed its secrets in fragments. A hurried gesture, a carefully measured pause, an overlooked note. Each piece would fold into the larger picture slowly, quietly, the sort of puzzle that Oxford cultivates as a reward for patience and attentiveness. And yet, even in the calm of observation, I sensed the underlying tension, the quiet interplay of pride and caution among those who inhabited these ancient spaces. The shadows of the garden were not merely cast by trees and walls. They were born of human ambition and fear, the subtle negotiation of intellect and emotion that shapes even the most serene of landscapes. It was in these shadows, I realized, that the first true stirrings of mystery awaited discovery, elusive and waiting for patient eyes. It was well past tea when Lewis appeared, leaning slightly against the door frame as if the weight of the day pressed upon him more heavily than usual. He held a folded newspaper in one hand, the other adjusting the strap of his shoulder bag, and I noted, without remark, the faint crease at his brow that bespoke impatience or concern. His voice, when he spoke, carried its usual urgency, but beneath it lay an undercurrent of unease, the kind that always signals more than mere routine reporting. He told me of Dr. Alden, found unconscious in his rooms, a manuscript page missing. The words themselves were simple, but the implications spread outward, fractal in their reach. I watched Lewis as he recounted the discovery, noting the subtle tension in his stance, the way his fingers flexed against the paper, the small hitch in his voice when he mentioned the archivist's involvement. It is in these micro-movements that Oxford teaches one to rid character, to parse anxiety from habit, and I catalogued them quietly. People reveal themselves in the incidental glance, a pause, a hand that lingers just slightly too long on the edge of a ledge. The rooms where Dr. Alden had been described to me in detail, wooden floors scuffed in corners, books lying open as though interrupted mid-thought, the faint aroma of port lingering, half evaporated. I imagined the scene, assembling it in my mind with careful attention, noting the minor inconsistencies. A chair slightly pulled away from the desk, a single sheet of parchment lying askew atop a stack of neatly ordered folios. Small details, almost imperceptible, yet often more telling than any statement made aloud. Lewis's narrative wandered briefly into conjecture, suggesting accident or fainting, yet I sensed his own doubts pressing against his words. There was a subtle incongruity, a hesitation when he mentioned the time at which the manuscript page had last been verified as present. The mention of a window left slightly ajar, a curtain fluttering with the late afternoon breeze, drew my attention. The inconsequential movement of fabric often shadows consequential actions. I asked no questions at first, letting him speak, watching the slight reddening of his ears, the careful modulation of his tone. Even in a familiar companion, such micro-reactions betray hidden observations, the things one does not say. I filed away the mention of the missing page, the ledger left open in the library, the faint marks upon the carpet, each a whisper of intent or carelessness, or perhaps both. When he finally paused, I took the paper from his hand, noting a small smudge along the edge, perhaps coffee or ink, and the slight misalignment of the fold. It seemed trivial, yet in a collection of deliberate minutiae, triviality becomes noteworthy. A crossword left open on a desk caught my eye, the clue for absence intersecting with another hinting at concealment. I did not mention it, but the echo of its metaphorical resonance was unmistakable, threading quietly through the events he had described. Lewis departed shortly afterward, leaving me alone in the dimming light, the scent of paper and ink rising from the stack of notes he had left behind. I lingered, tracing the map of the day in my mind, allowing the sequence of gestures, glances, and half-stated observations to settle into a pattern just faintly discernible. The case, if it could yet be called that, was opening slowly, delicately, like a flower in shadow, and I felt, with a quiet certainty, that the missing page was only the beginning of what Oxford had hidden from easy view. It was late in the evening when I returned to my quarters, the rain having begun to patter gently against the window panes, blurring the shapes of lamplit streets below. I placed a cup of tea on the small table and unfolded the newspaper Lewis had left earlier, allowing the familiar ritual of scanning the crossword to settle my mind. There is, I have often thought, something singular in the act of filling a grid with words, a kind of quiet order against the chaos of daily observation, a private negotiation between intellect and instinct. One clue caught my eye almost immediately. For reasons I could not yet articulate the definition of a king, obscured by metaphor, intersecting with a word implying concealment. I paused, pen in hand, feeling the familiar stir of curiosity, the quiet thrill that accompanies the recognition of pattern. A puzzle in print mirrored the puzzles in life, reminding me that details, trivial in isolation, often contain their own resonance when placed against context. I reflected on Dr. Alden, his misaligned footsteps in the garden, the slight tremor in his hand, the glance that lingered too long on a shelf of manuscripts. These gestures were minor, almost imperceptible, yet in combination they formed a lattice of human intention, each link faintly illuminated by the analogy of crossword clues. One observes the obvious, yes, but also the spaces left between, where meaning seeps quietly through omission. The faint smell of damp books rose from the shelves, mingling with the aroma of my tea, and I considered the archivist's reaction to the anonymous note, the quick intake of breath, the momentary tightening of shoulders. It is a habit of mine, cataloguing these subtleties, noting each hesitation, each almost imperceptible deviation from expectation. Oxford rewards patience, and the mind must sometimes trace the meandering path of attention before insight emerges. I noticed, too, the slight curl of the manuscript page beneath glass. A corner turned just so, the sort of inadvertent gesture that seems trivial until the eye returns to it, like a crossword answer fitting neatly into the grid. Small errors, human imperfections, often leave the most telling marks. I jotted a note, a single line, as if recording the whisper of some unseen hand guiding events from behind the veil of ordinary observation. A low wind rattled the window, and I thought of the evening's lectures, the hushed voices in the hallways, the faint shuffle of steps on stone. Each sound, each shadow, is a clue of its own kind, and yet only when one pauses to align them. With remembered gestures, with minutiae observed and filed, do they begin to resonate. The crossword, in its deliberate simplicity, reminded me that insight requires patience, that the smallest connection can illuminate what otherwise remains unseen. I leaned back, allowing the pen to hover above the paper, letting my mind trace the intersections between word and act, between metaphor and reality. There is a rhythm to observation, a cadence that must be felt, not forced, and in that quiet, the faint glimmer of understanding begins to flicker. The manuscript, the note, the minor gestures, the crossword, they were threads of the same tapestry, delicate yet coherent, and I felt the first, almost imperceptible pull of their interconnection. As I closed the notebook and set it aside, I understood that the day's discoveries had yet to speak fully, that their whispers were meant to be traced, reconsidered, and aligned with patience. The puzzle was far from solved, yet the echo of words across print and shadow had begun to guide me, a subtle compass through the quiet labyrinth of Oxford's concealed truths. The archivist asked me to follow her into a side corridor, one of those narrow, seldomest passages where the stone walls seem to absorb sound and time itself feels slowed. The faint smell of mildew mingled with old leather, a fragrance I've come to associate with secrets long kept, and I noticed, without comment, the slight quiver in her hands as she smoothed the edge of a folio. She paused at a small alcove, as though ensuring we were unseen, and then spoke in a voice low enough to be almost private, recounting an incident from years before, a detail that had never been mentioned in the official record. She described the misplacement of a manuscript page, the casual negligence of a visiting scholar, and the subtle manipulations that followed to preserve the integrity of the collection. Her eyes flicked toward mine as though gauging the impact of each word, and I caught the briefest tightening around her mouth, a small hesitation that spoke of both guilt and relief. Human emotions are often more revealing than any document. One notices the pause before a breath, the micro-movement of a shoulder, and files it quietly for later consideration. The confession continued, revealing the existence of an altered letter, a diary entry omitted from the catalogue, and the small annotations in the margin of a folio that had seemed trivial until now. I observed the way she traced her finger along the edge of a shelf, the faint pressure suggesting a careful concealment of knowledge, the kind one practices not from malice but from a sense of duty, however flawed. It is in such small acts, often unnoticed, that human character asserts itself most clearly. A fleeting glance at a ledger lying open on a nearby desk drew my attention to the handwriting slightly misaligned, an ink blot at the intersection of two lines, a mark that suggested a hasty correction. Such trivialities are not accidental, and I stored them away, noting the interplay between document and gesture, between statement and silence. The archivist's narrative was layered with omission as much as revelation, and it was precisely these gaps that provided the first glimmers of comprehension. As she recounted the circumstances of the missing page's eventual discovery, I noticed the subtle flutter of her sleeve, the almost imperceptible tilt of her head, and the brief, almost involuntary arch of an eyebrow. Each signifier, each minor deviation from the expected, was a signal, a whisper that hinted at motives shaped by loyalty, embarrassment, and a profound respect for history. Oxford teaches that the smallest detail can unlock the largest mystery the archivist was offering, both confession and clue in equal measure. She concluded with a quiet acknowledgement of the consequences, not merely for herself, but for the reputation of those involved, the legacy of the manuscript, and the unseen ripple of events set in motion long ago. I listened, tracing her words against my own observations, noting the alignment between spoken fact and unspoken meaning. Even in the shadows of stone corridors and forgotten alcoves, human behavior casts traces one only needs to look closely. When I finally left the corridor, the evening air damp against my coat, I carried with me more than information. I carried the pattern of hesitation, the interplay of concealment and revelation, and the knowledge that the manuscript's story was entwined irrevocably with those who had guarded it, each act of omission or preservation echoing softly across the quiet halls of King's College. I returned to the library alone that evening, the fading light spilling through the tall windows and painting elongated shadows across the parquet floor. The air was damp, with the lingering scent of rain on stone, and the faint odor of old paper seemed heavier than usual, as though the manuscripts themselves had absorbed the weight of recent events. I moved slowly, deliberately, retracing steps I had already taken, examining once more the minutiae I had catalogued over the preceding days. The ledger lay open where it had been left, a slight crease along the spine indicating that someone had returned to it since my last inspection. I noted a small smudge in the margin of a particular entry, a barely perceptible difference in ink, suggesting a hurried annotation. I remembered the archivist's confession, the trembling of her hands as she described a misplaced page, and I considered the cumulative impact of gesture and document, action and hesitation. These were the threads from which understanding might be woven. I glanced toward the display case containing the manuscript, the glass reflecting faint light in a manner that almost obscured the text beneath. A corner of the page was slightly lifted, the curl subtle yet deliberate, as though someone had handled it with care, but not without urgency. The faintest fingerprint, nearly invisible, marked the vellum in a pattern that suggested the grip of a right hand, careful, deliberate, not quite casual. I made a mental note, the kind of observation that waits quietly until the mind is ready to interpret it. On a nearby table lay the crossword I had begun earlier in the week, left incomplete, the pen resting idly across the page. One clue, for a word meaning obscured, intersected with another, implying watchful. It seemed, almost too conveniently, to echo the sequence of human actions I had observed. The overlooked gestures, the furtive glances, the hesitations that had passed unnoticed. I could not say whether this was mere coincidence or a quiet signal of intent, but it lent a certain rhythm to my re-examination, a cadence in which connections began to emerge. I retraced the path through the corridors where the archivist and I had walked, noting once again the slight misalignment of floorboards, the faint impressions left in dust, the almost imperceptible creak of a door swung too forcefully. Each minor anomaly was now part of a larger pattern, a lattice of human behavior and circumstance. The subtlety of it is what makes observation both difficult and rewarding. The mind must balance patience with insight, restraint with recognition. A discarded note, previously overlooked, lay partially tucked beneath a shelf. The writing was small, precise, and the ink slightly dampened from the morning's humidity. I lifted it carefully, aware that such trifles often contain more meaning than the grander gestures of intention. In the context of the other observations, the misaligned ledger, the lifted page, the hushed movements in the garden, it became a faint signal, one that would later prove significant in assembling the full picture. As I stood in the quiet of the library, the echoes of footsteps long gone lingering in the stones, I felt the gradual convergence of evidence and intuition. The smallest details, the gestures unremarked upon, the inconsistencies in speech and movement, all began to flicker with meaning. Understanding, as I had often learned, arrives not in clarity but in accumulation and in the stillness of this place. The contours of truth began to reveal themselves slowly, delicately, and with the faintest edge of melancholy. It was late afternoon when I returned to the library, the light fading behind the tall windows and casting a soft, amber glow across the stone floor. The room was quiet, the usual faint creak of floorboards subdued beneath the weight of thought. I moved deliberately among the shelves, tracing the lines of tomes as though expecting them to whisper their secrets, aware that Oxford often hides its truths in the most unremarkable places. The scent of parchment and old leather mingled with the faint dampness seeping through the window frames, a perfume that seemed inseparable from human curiosity and error. I'd come with a particular thought in mind: the missing manuscript page and the pattern of gestures, glances, and small anomalies that had accumulated in my memory over days. The archivist's confession, the furtive movements in the garden, the slightly lifted corner of a folio, and the marginal notes smudged in haste all suggested an unseen connection, a human signature in the otherwise orderly preservation of centuries. I moved slowly, letting the eyes of the past meet my own, patient, deliberate, seeking the moment when the overlooked might become visible. A small door, concealed behind a tall cabinet, caught my attention. Its edge was subtly uneven, a shadow that suggested disturbance. I knelt, noting the fine dust along the hinge, the faint scrape along the threshold, as though someone had entered here hurriedly, yet with care. The placement was clever, unremarkable to the casual observer, yet entirely consistent with the movements I had documented earlier. The invisible becomes visible to those who linger, and I allowed myself a quiet satisfaction in the recognition. Inside, a narrow compartment held a single folio, the missing page finally restored to view. The vellum was pale, its ink precise, yet it bore the subtle smudges and fingerprints of human handling. I studied it carefully, noting the manner in which the writing aligned with other pages, the tiny notations at the margins, the deliberate placement that suggested both reverence and concealment. The discovery was not dramatic. No gasp or revelation, only the quiet satisfaction of observing what had been hidden, of understanding a human choice preserved in subtlety and craft. I traced the faint indentations in the margin, recalling the young fellow's nervous glance, the archivist's hesitations, the curator's practiced gestures. Each had left a mark, slight, almost imperceptible, yet telling. Oxford teaches that significance lies not in grand acts, but in minutiae, the precise arrangement of hands and eyes, the timing of footsteps, the unintended imprint of emotion on objects meant to endure beyond memory. A forgotten note, partially concealed beneath the folio, bore a line written hastily, referencing both caution and loyalty. It connected the hidden page to the actions observed over days, a subtle confirmation that the concealment had been deliberate, protective, and weighted with the sense of history. Even the crossword clue I had noted days before now seemed to echo this hidden choreography absence, intersecting with watchfulness, a metaphor rendered in action. I replaced the folio carefully, leaving the compartment as undisturbed as I found it, aware that the act of discovery is often quieter than the consequences it implies. The manuscript was whole again, yet the human stories entwined with its preservation remained unresolved, a lattice of pride, caution, and devotion that would outlast any single observation. As I walked back into the hall, the fading light brushing the walls, I felt the persistent pull of curiosity, the faint ache that comes with understanding, and the quiet knowledge that in Oxford the hidden is never entirely gone, merely waiting for the patient eye to perceive it. I arranged for the small gathering in the library just as the afternoon light began to wane, casting long shadows across the worn stone floors and tall shelves of tomes. The curator, the archivist, the younger scholar, and a few fellows had been summoned, each with a pretense of casual conversation, yet each carrying a measure of apprehension. I watched them enter, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the way eyes met and avoided one another, the quiet adjustments of coats and scarves as though these minor movements could shield them from observation. I began with simple recapitulation, recounting the events of the past days, careful to leave space for reflection and reaction. The missing manuscript page, the anonymous note, the minor disturbances in the garden, all were described in measured tones, allowing the facts themselves to breathe. I observed the flicker of recognition, the slight tightening of hands on chair arms, the almost imperceptible tilt of heads. Each gesture, though unspoken, carried meaning. A question arose regarding the ledger, and I allowed it to be voiced fully before noting the misalignment of the ink, the hastily corrected notation, a minor anomaly previously dismissed as clerical. The young scholar's lips pressed together, a nearly invisible quiver betraying something unspoken, while the archivist's gaze drifted involuntarily toward the display case, where the manuscript lay in quiet repose. The curator's hand moved slightly, brushing against a folio as though to anchor himself to some sense of order. I drew attention to the subtle evidence gathered over days, a faint crease in a folio, a smudge of ink, the displaced branch in the garden, a folded note discovered beneath a shelf. Each small detail was laid alongside the others, forming a lattice of human action and omission. I watched carefully, noting the minute hesitation before a response, the almost imperceptible exchange of glances, the subtlest flicker of guilt or relief across the features of those present. I described the hidden compartment, the recovered manuscript page, and the context in which it had been concealed. The archivist's hands, resting lightly on a desk, betrayed both pride and apprehension, while the young scholar's foot shifted, drawing attention to the careful concealment of evidence. I allowed the silence to settle after each revelation, observing the reactions in the absence of interruption, for often truth is spoken in quiet and stillness. Finally, I turned to the intersecting threads, the gestures, the omissions, the patterns of action and restraint that suggested a deliberate orchestration. Each participant had contributed, knowingly or otherwise, to the concealment, the minor acts of preservation or misdirection. The lines of responsibility, though diffuse, began to clarify in the shared acknowledgement of the assembled group. It was not a matter of accusation alone, but of understanding, of recognizing the human motivations intertwined with scholarship and pride. As the meeting drew to a close, I allowed the silence to linger, noting the stillness of the room, the fading light, the scent of parchment and ink, the subtle tremor of anticipation or relief in each posture. The manuscript was restored, the facts laid bare, and yet the quiet tensions remained, the lingering echoes of ambition, caution, and human complexity. In that stillness, I recognized the delicate interplay of intellect and emotion, the subtle poetry of human behavior that had guided the events to this moment, and the persistent pull of unresolved thought that would accompany Oxford long after the room had emptied. The evening fell slowly over Oxford, the spires casting long shadows across streets damp with a late drizzle, the cobblestones gleaming faintly in the lamplight. I walked alone, the sound of my footsteps muted by the hush of the city settling into night. There was a certain melancholy in the air, a quiet reflection that Oxford has always inspired, and I allowed myself to linger in it, observing the interplay of light and shadow, the subtle movements of those few souls still venturing through the wet streets. The manuscript had been restored, the concealed folio returned to its place, and yet the events of the past days had left their imprint not only on the collection, but upon those who had guarded it. I thought of the archivist, her confession lingering in memory, the delicate tremor in her hands, the careful pacing of her words. Human intent, ambition, and pride are often revealed in the subtlest gestures, and it is in those quiet moments that understanding grows, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Passing the garden, I noted the fallen leaves, scattered in patterns that suggested recent movement, a reminder of the furtive steps, the small anxieties, and the careful observation that had occupied so many over the course of the investigation. I remembered the young scholar's nervous glance, the curator's fleeting hesitation, the minutiae that had seemed inconsequential at the time, a crease in a ledger, a smudge of ink, a misaligned folio. Each detail had contributed to the unfolding pattern, like the intersecting lines of a crossword, subtle and precise. I paused at the bridge, the water beneath reflecting the dim glow of the street lamps and the occasional shimmer of passing clouds. The city seemed to exhale, a sigh of damp stone and fading light, and I allowed myself a rare moment of reflection. Oxford is a city of hidden rhythms, of human gestures that linger beyond the apparent, of truths half concealed in plain sight. The manuscript was a single thread in a tapestry of pride, secrecy, and careful guardianship, and the resolution of its concealment did not erase the quiet complexities of those involved. I thought, too, of Lewis, who had accompanied me through fragments of the investigation, whose practical instinct often balanced my own penchant for observation. The day's events had left its mark on him as well, subtle shifts in posture, the thoughtful pause before a word, the unspoken acknowledgement of the delicate dance between intellect and caution. Understanding, I realized, is not merely a product of observation, but of empathy, a recognition of the motives and anxieties that propel human action. The rain began again, fine and steady, tracing faint rivulets along the edges of the pavement. I moved on, the sound of water blending with the distant toll of a tower bell, a cadence both melancholic and reassuring. The city seemed to breathe with history, the faint whisper of centuries present in every step, every stone, every shadow. The mysteries of Oxford do not vanish with daylight. They linger in echoes, in gestures, in the faint marks left by human hands. As I returned to my quarters, I allowed the quiet to settle over me, noting the alignment of facts and observation, of human intent and consequence. The manuscript rested in its place, but the memories of its concealment, the subtle tensions and careful maneuvers, remained vivid. In that stillness, I felt the persistent ache of understanding and the quiet satisfaction that comes from tracing the invisible patterns of thought and action. Oxford had revealed its secret, if only partially, and I walked on, aware that some truths endure as quietly as the evening shadows, unresolved yet illuminating.